I'm Isolde Marelly, 27 years old. Until 6 months ago, I believed that family meant everything, and sacrifice was love. Then I overheard my siblings laughing about how I'd become the maid at our father's farm, and everything changed. Their casual cruelty hit me like a physical blow, especially knowing I'd given up a pastry scholarship in France to care for Dad after his stroke. My brother Cassian's words still echo in my mind. At least we don't have to worry about the house anymore. Izzy's got it handled. What they didn't know was that I had been secretly documenting every sacrifice, every missed opportunity, every moment of being invisible for 3 years. I'd been planning something they never saw coming. But here's what makes this story unbelievable. The very thing that broke me also became the foundation for everything I built next. What happens when the family scapegoat refuses to disappear? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Morning, I realized I'd become invisible, started like any other at Elkridge Hollow. I woke before sunrise to the familiar symphony of creaking floorboards and settling wood that had become the soundtrack of my confined existence. The farmhouse, built in 1892, held the weight of 4 generations of Marelly history in its bones, and sometimes I felt like I was drowning in all that accumulated legacy. I padded downstairs in my worn slippers, past the gallery of family photographs that seemed to mock me with their frozen moments of happier times. There was Mom at 25, radiant in her wedding dress, standing next to Dad when he still had that confident gleam in his eyes. There was Cassian at his college graduation, Dell at her first art show opening, and me, always me, lingering, in the background of everyone else's achievements, smiling supportively from the sidelines. The kitchen welcomed me with the scent of yesterday's bread and the lingering ghost of Mom's lavender soap, which I still used because it made the house feel less empty. I moved through my morning routine with practiced efficiency. Coffee first, strong and black, then checking Dad's medication schedule, then surveying what needed to be done before the day officially began for everyone else. Dad's stroke 3 years ago had rewritten all our family dynamics in ways we were still discovering. The man who once commanded respect across 3 counties, who could negotiate cattle prices with the sharpest dealers and still come out ahead, now struggled to button his own shirts. His left side remained largely uncooperative, and his speech, while much improved, still carried the halting quality that broke my heart every time I heard it. I found him in his study, already awake and staring out the window at the fields that stretched toward the horizon. The land itself told the story of our family's gradual decline. Once productive pastures now overgrown with weeds, fences that sagged under their own neglect, and the old red barn that listed slightly to the east like a ship taking on water. "Morning, Dad." I set his coffee down on the desk beside his chair, next to the pile of bills I'd been managing since I moved back home. "How did you sleep?" He turned toward me with that slight delay that always preceded his words now. "Better than I deserved, too, I suppose." His voice carried the gruff honesty that had never changed, even when everything else had. "You're up early again." "Same time as always." I settled into the chair across from him, cradling my own mug. "The Anderson place looks like they're finally selling. Saw the realtor's sign go up yesterday." Dad's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. The Anderson farm bordered ours to the south, and its sale would likely bring developers, or worse, one of those massive agricultural corporations that were slowly consuming family farms across the county. We both knew our land would be next if we couldn't find a way to make it profitable again. "Cassian called last night," Dad said, his words careful and measured. "Said he's sending more money this month." I nodded, swallowing the familiar mixture of gratitude and resentment that came with my brother's financial contributions. Cassian worked in tech in Seattle, making more money than our family had ever dreamed of, but money was his way of staying connected while remaining safely distant. He'd visited exactly 3 times since Dad's stroke, each visit shorter than the last. "That's good of him," I managed, though we both knew it was a complicated kind of good. The truth was, Cassian's money kept us afloat, but it also kept him from having to confront what his absence meant. Dell, my younger sister, was even more elusive. She'd call sporadically from New York, full of updates about her fashion design program, and careful questions about Dad's health that always seemed designed to confirm that I had everything under control. I'd learned to give them exactly the answers they wanted to hear. After Dad's breakfast and his morning physical therapy routine, which I'd taught myself through YouTube videos and sheer determination, I escaped to the only place in the house that still felt entirely mine. Mom's old sewing room. She died 2 years before Dad's stroke, a quiet passing that left us all unprepared for how much her steady presence had been holding our family together. The room had become my makeshift office, where I managed the farm's finances on an ancient laptop and tried to stretch every dollar until it screamed. But it was also where I'd been secretly working on something else entirely. Hidden in a folder on my desktop, carefully password protected, was a collection of documents I'd never shown anyone. Photos, receipts, medical records, correspondence with my siblings, detailed logs of every conversation where they'd made assumptions about my availability, my choices, my willingness to sacrifice my own life for the family's needs. I wasn't sure what I planned to do with it all, but documenting everything had become a kind of therapy. It helped me feel less crazy when I questioned whether I was being too sensitive or demanding too much. The evidence was there in black and white. 3 years of my life, carefully cataloged and preserved. My phone buzzed with a text from Dell. "How's Dad? Can't call today, swamped with finals prep." I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back. "He's fine. Everything's handled." It was what she wanted to hear, and I'd become expert at giving people what they wanted to hear. But something about typing those words made me feel hollowed out in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The afternoon brought Lorraine Harbo to our front door, carrying a casserole dish and wearing the expression of someone who'd been planning this visit for weeks. Lorraine had been Mom's best friend since high school, and she'd made it her mission to check on our family with the persistence of someone who actually cared about the details. "Izzy, honey, you look thin," she announced, pushing past me into the kitchen with the confidence of someone who'd been visiting this house for 30 years. "And don't tell me you're eating enough because I can see from here that you're not." Lorraine was 58, with steel gray hair she wore in a practical bob and the kind of directness that came from running the only bakery in Elkridge Hollow for the past 2 decades. She'd tried to hire me multiple times over the years, always, with the caveat that I could work around Dad's needs, but I'd never been able to make the schedules align with everything else I was managing. "I'm eating fine," I protested, though we both knew it was a lie. Cooking for one person felt pointless, when that person was usually too tired to taste anything anyway. Lorraine set the casserole on the counter and turned to face me with her arms crossed. "And how's your social life? Dating anyone? Going out with friends?" The questions hit their mark with surgical precision. My social life had evaporated, gradually, the way morning mist disappears without anyone noticing exactly when it's gone. Friends had stopped calling when I couldn't make plans anymore. Dating felt like a luxury I couldn't afford, both financially and emotionally. "I'm fine, Lorraine." "Really?" She studied my face with the intensity of someone reading a map. "Honey, you can't pour from an empty cup forever. Your mama used to say that about herself, and I wish I'd pushed her harder to listen." The mention of Mom created a familiar ache in my chest. She'd been the family's emotional center, the one who remembered birthdays and smoothed over conflicts and made sure everyone felt seen and valued. After she died, I'd somehow inherited that role without anyone ever asking if I wanted it. "I know, you mean well," I said carefully. "But this is just how things are right now. Your dad needs you to have a life," Lorraine interrupted. "He needs to know that you're not sacrificing everything for him, because that's not what love looks like. That's what fear looks like." Her words hung in the air between us, uncomfortable and true in a way that made me want to change the subject. Immediately. "I should check on him," I said, already moving toward the study. But Lorraine caught my arm gently. Izzy, when's the last time you did something just for yourself? Something that had nothing to do with taking care of anyone else? I opened my mouth to answer and realized I couldn't remember. The realization was more terrifying than I'd expected. That evening, after Dad had gone to bed and the house settled into its familiar nighttime silence, I found myself back in Mom's sewing room, staring at my secret collection of documents. But instead of adding to it, I opened a new folder and labeled it something different. What I want. I stared at the empty folder for a long time, cursor blinking in the silence. Finally, I typed a single line. I want to matter to someone who isn't dying or disappearing. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Outside my window, Elk Ridge Hollow stretched away into darkness, holding its secrets and its sleeping families, its struggling farms and its quiet dreams. Somewhere out there, people were living lives that belonged entirely to themselves. Somewhere out there, people were making choices based on their own desires instead of everyone else's needs. I saved the document and closed the laptop, but the words stayed with me as I made my way upstairs to bed. For the first time in 3 years, I fell asleep thinking about what I wanted instead of what everyone else needed. I had no way of knowing that in less than 2 weeks, I would overhear a conversation that would change everything, but maybe some part of me was already preparing for the moment when I would finally stop being invisible, even to myself. The conversation that shattered my world happened on a Thursday evening in March, when the spring air still carried the bite of winter, and the farmhouse felt particularly hollow. Cassian had made one of his rare visits home, ostensibly to discuss family business, though I suspected it was really because his latest girlfriend had broken up with him and he needed somewhere to lick his wounds. Dell had surprised us all by driving up from New York, claiming she needed a break from the city's intensity. She'd arrived with designer luggage and that particular kind of restless energy that came from someone who'd forgotten how quiet the country could be. I'd spent the day cooking, cleaning, and preparing the house for what felt like a performance of family togetherness. I'd made Cassian's favorite pot roast and Dell's preferred lemon cake, set out the good china that Mom had saved for special occasions, and even convinced Dad to wear his newer shirt instead of the faded flannel he preferred. The 3 of them had gathered in the living room after dinner while I cleaned up in the kitchen. The old farmhouse had thin walls, and voices carried easily between rooms, but I'd learned to filter out most conversations as white noise. I was focused on scrubbing the roasting pan when I heard my name mentioned, and something in Cassian's tone made me freeze. "At least we don't have to worry about the house anymore," he was saying, his voice carrying that casual satisfaction of someone who'd solved a problem without actually having to deal with it. "Izzy's got it handled." I set down the sponge, my hands still sudsy, and moved closer to the doorway. I told myself I wasn't eavesdropping, just checking to see if they needed anything, but my feet stayed planted just out of sight. "I know, but don't you feel guilty sometimes?" Dell's voice was quieter, uncertain in a way that was unusual for her. I mean, she gave up everything. The scholarship, her apartment, that job at the restaurant she loved. "She made her choice," Cassian replied, and I could hear him settling deeper into Dad's old recliner. Nobody forced her to come back. She could have said no. The casual dismissal in his voice hit me like a physical blow. Could have said no. As if I'd had real options when Dad was lying in a hospital bed, unable to speak clearly, and the doctors were talking about long-term care needs and family support systems. "But still," Dell persisted, "sometimes I wonder if we're taking advantage. I mean, look at her. When's the last time she went anywhere or did anything for herself?" "Dell, she's fine." Cassian's voice had taken on that slightly irritated edge he got when people challenged his comfortable assumptions. "She likes being needed. Some people are just built for that kind of life. Built for that kind of life." The words echoed in my head like a diagnosis I'd never asked for. "I guess," Dell said, though she didn't sound convinced. "It's just, remember how she used to talk about Paris, about that pastry program? She was so excited, and then real life happened." Cassian finished. "Look, I send money every month. You visit when you can. We're not abandoning her. She's getting something out of this arrangement too. Free housing, no rent, no real responsibilities except keeping Dad comfortable. No real responsibilities." I pressed my back against the kitchen wall, my heart hammering so hard I was sure they could hear it from the next room. "I know, but," Dell started. "Besides," Cassian continued, and I could hear the smile in his voice. Now, the way his tone lightened when he thought he was being clever. "It's not like we're asking her to be a servant or anything. She's not exactly, the maid." They all laughed. Dad's chuckle was quiet and brief, the kind of automatic response he gave when he wasn't really paying attention. Dell's laugh was uncomfortable, guilty. But Cassian's laughter was genuine, amused by his own wit. The maid. I stood in that kitchen, surrounded by the dishes I'd washed and the floors I'd mopped and the meal I'd prepared, and felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. It was like a bone breaking, but quieter. Like the moment when you realize that the ground you've been standing on has been eroding for years, and you've just now noticed that you're falling. I walked very carefully back to the sink and finished washing the roasting pan. My hands moved, automatically while my mind raced, processing 3 years of interactions through this new, devastating lens. Every time Cassian had called to check in, but really to make sure I was handling everything. Every time Dell had visited and complimented how well I was managing before disappearing back to her real life. Every time Dad had quietly accepted my care without acknowledging what I'd given up to provide it. The maid. "Izzy?" Dell's voice came from the doorway, startling me back to the present. "Do you need help with anything?" I turned around, and she must have seen something in my expression because her smile faltered. "I'm fine," I said, the words coming out steadier than I'd expected. "Just finishing up." She lingered in the doorway, studying my face with the sudden attention of someone who'd been caught not paying attention for too long. "Are you sure? You look..." "I look what?" "I don't know. Different." I dried my hands on the dish towel, taking my time, choosing my words carefully. "Different how?" Dell shifted uncomfortably. "Just, I don't know. Are you okay? Really okay?" For a moment, I considered telling her the truth. I considered explaining that I'd heard their conversation, that I understood now how they saw me, that I was realizing how completely I'd disappeared into the role they'd needed me to play. But looking at her face, I could see that she didn't really want to know. She wanted reassurance that everything was fine, that she could go back to New York without guilt, that the comfortable arrangement would continue indefinitely. "I'm perfectly fine," I said, and watched the relief wash over her features. That night, after they'd all gone to bed, I sat in Mom's sewing room with my laptop open, staring at the folder labeled "What I Want." The single line I'd written weeks ago seemed inadequate now. I want to matter to someone who isn't dying or disappearing. I deleted it and started over. I want to stop being invisible, I typed. I want my choices to be acknowledged. I want my sacrifices to be seen. I want to matter in my own life. I paused, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, then continued. I want them to understand what they've taken from me. I want them to see who I really am, not just who they need me to be. I want to reclaim the parts of myself I gave away. It felt dangerous, writing those words. Like I was admitting to wants I wasn't supposed to have, claiming space I wasn't supposed to occupy. But the most dangerous thought came last, and I typed it before I could lose my nerve. I want them to need me the way I've needed them, and to find out what it feels like when that need isn't met. I stared at the words for a long time. This secret declaration of independence that no one would ever see. Then I saved the document and closed the laptop, but the words pulsed in my mind like a heartbeat. Upstairs, I could hear the familiar sounds of the old house settling, the creaks and sighs that had become the background music of my constrained existence. But for the first time in 3 years, I fell asleep planning instead of just surviving. I didn't know yet what I was planning exactly. I didn't know that within months I would be running a secret business, transforming unused parts of our property into income, and documenting my journey in ways that would eventually reach thousands of people who felt just as invisible as I had. I didn't know that I was about to discover strengths I'd forgotten I possessed, or that the very family dynamics that had trapped me would become the foundation for my escape. All I knew was that something had broken open inside me, and I was finally ready to find out what was underneath all that careful, sacrificial silence. The next morning, Cassian and Dell would leave, returning to their real lives with casual hugs and promises to call more often. Dad would settle back into his routine, comfortable in the knowledge that I would continue managing everything that needed managing, but I would not be the same person they left behind. The maid, they'd called me. They had no idea that they'd just awakened something in their dutiful, invisible caretaker that would change all of our lives forever. And for the first time since I'd given up my scholarship and moved back to Elkridge Hollow, I found myself smiling as I drifted off to sleep. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The week after Cassian and Dell left, I moved through my usual routines with a strange new awareness, as if I were watching myself from the outside. Every task I performed, folding Dad's laundry, organizing his medications, preparing his meals, felt simultaneously familiar and foreign, like I was playing a role in a play I'd somehow memorized without ever auditioning for. Dad noticed the change first, though he couldn't quite identify what was different. "You're quiet lately," he observed during breakfast, his words carrying that careful deliberation they'd held since the stroke. "More quiet than usual." I looked up from my coffee, surprised that my internal revolution was visible to anyone else. "I'm always quiet, Dad." "Different quiet," he insisted, studying my face with the intensity he used to reserve for livestock appraisals. Thinking quiet. He wasn't wrong. I was thinking constantly now, processing 3 years of interactions through this new lens of understanding. I was remembering phone calls where my siblings had assumed I'd handle things, family discussions where my preferences had never been asked for, moments when my needs had been so invisible that even I had forgotten they existed. But I was also beginning to notice things I'd overlooked before. The way Dad's eyes followed me around the kitchen when he thought I wasn't looking. A mixture of gratitude and something that might have been guilt. The careful way he asked for things, as if he were afraid I might say no. The stack of agricultural magazines he'd started leaving on my desk, folded open to articles about farm diversification and alternative income streams. "Dad," I said carefully, setting down my mug. "Do you ever think about what you would do if I wasn't here?" The question seemed to startle him. His coffee cup paused halfway to his lips, and I watched him process my words with that careful deliberation that marked all his responses now. "You are here," he said finally. "But if I wasn't, if I had taken that scholarship, or if I decided to move back to the city, what would you do?" He was quiet for so long that I wondered if he'd forgotten the question. Then, "I suppose I'd figure something out. People do. People do," I repeated. "What kind of something?" Another long pause. "Assisted living, maybe, or one of those care services. Expensive, but..." He shrugged, the gesture lopsided but expressive. "Money's just money." The casual acknowledgement that alternatives existed, that my presence was chosen rather than essential, should have been liberating. Instead, it felt like another small betrayal. If there had always been other options, then my sacrifice had been as invisible to him as it was to my siblings. "Is that what you'd prefer?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "God, no." His response was immediate and emphatic. "Izzy, this is better. Having you here is better. I just meant I wouldn't want you to feel—" He trailed off, searching for words that had become more elusive since the stroke. "Trapped?" I supplied. "Obligated," he said finally. "I wouldn't want you to feel obligated. But I did feel obligated, and we both knew it. The obligation was woven into every aspect of our daily life, from the way he relied on me for meals to the way I'd restructured my entire existence around his needs. The obligation was so complete that I'd forgotten what my own preferences felt like. That afternoon, while Dad napped in his chair, I found myself walking the perimeter of our property for the first time in months. The farm sprawled across 42 acres of rolling hills and overgrown pastures, most of it unused since we'd sold the cattle 2 years ago. Mom's vegetable garden had gone wild, tomato plants and bean poles overtaken by weeds and volunteer squash. But as I walked, I began to see the land differently. The old barn, which we'd been thinking of as an eyesore and a liability, could be repurposed. The pasture closest to the road had good drainage and plenty of sun. The cottage where my great-grandfather had lived until he died, currently serving as expensive storage for broken farm equipment, had good bones and its own electrical meter. I found myself taking pictures with my phone, documenting angles and possibilities I'd never considered before. When I uploaded them to my laptop that evening, I stared at the images with growing excitement. This wasn't just unused land, this was potential. I spent the next several days researching rural business opportunities, farm diversification strategies, and small-scale agricultural ventures. I learned about agritourism, farm-to-table operations, and the growing market for locally sourced products. I discovered that our county offered micro-grants for agricultural innovation, and that there was a waiting list for seasonal farm rentals in our area. But the idea that captured my imagination most completely was the simplest one. Lorraine Harbaugh's repeated suggestions that I had a gift for baking. I'd always assumed she was just being kind, the way people compliment hobbies they don't really understand. But as I researched the local food scene, I realized there was a genuine gap in the market. Elkridge Hollow was growing, attracting young families and remote workers who wanted country living without giving up urban amenities. These newcomers were willing to pay premium prices for artisanal products, especially baked goods made with local ingredients. I started small, almost secretly. I began baking again, not just the occasional cake for family visits, but serious baking. Sourdough, breads that required days of careful tending, pastries that demanded precision and patience, desserts that showcased techniques I'd learned but never had reason to use. Dad noticed immediately. "Smells like your mother's kitchen again," he said one evening, breathing in the scent of honey oat bread cooling on the counter. "She always said you had the touch for it." "Mom said that?" "All the time." He smiled, the expression more complete than usual. "Said you saw baking like she saw people, understanding what they needed before they knew it themselves." It was the first time in years that anyone had compared me to Mom in a way that felt like recognition rather than replacement. I started documenting everything: recipes, costs, time investments, results. I photographed my finished products with the same careful attention I'd once given to tracking family finances. But these photos were different. They showed something I had created rather than something I had managed for someone else. When Lorraine stopped by the following week with another casserole, she froze in the doorway of the kitchen, staring at the cooling racks filled with various breads and pastries. "Isolde Marelly," she said slowly. "What exactly have you been up to?" I felt heat rise in my cheeks. Just experimenting. I had some extra time. She moved closer to examine my work, her experienced baker's eye cataloging techniques and results. She broke off a corner of my honey oat bread and chewed thoughtfully. "Extra time, my foot," she said finally. "This is professional quality work. How long have you been holding out on me?" "I'm not holding out on anything. I've been thinking about things differently lately." Lorraine studied my face with the same intensity she'd brought to evaluating. "My bread. Different how?" I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I've been thinking about what I want my life to look like, instead of just managing what it already looks like." "And what do you want it to look like?" The question hung between us, loaded with possibilities I was only beginning to understand. "I want to build something," I said finally. "Something that's mine." Lorraine nodded slowly. "Well, honey, if this bread is any indication, you're off to a hell of a start." She stayed for another hour, walking through my recent experiments and offering suggestions with the generosity of someone who understood the difference between competition and community. When she left, she took several samples with her, promising to test them on some discerning customers. 2 days later, she called with news that would change everything. "Izzy, I need you to sit down," she said without preamble. "I showed your bread to Mary Chen. You know, the woman who opened that farm-to-table restaurant in Millbrook? She wants to know if you'd be interested in supplying them with artisan breads. 3 types, twice a week. They're offering $12 a loaf. I did the math automatically. $12 a loaf, 6 loaves per delivery, 2 deliveries per week. That was nearly $300 in weekly income, just from bread." "They haven't even tasted my bread," I protested. "They tasted it today. I drove over there myself and made them try everything." Mary's exact words were, "This is the kind of quality that makes customers drive 40 minutes out of their way." I sat in Mom's sewing room that night, staring at a legal pad where I'd been sketching out business projections. For the first time, since I'd moved back to the farm, I was looking at numbers that represented possibility rather than limitation. But more than the money, I was excited about the idea of creating something valuable, something that people would seek out and appreciate. I was imagining a version of myself that existed beyond caretaking, beyond invisible sacrifice, beyond the careful management of everyone else's needs. I was imagining myself as someone who mattered in ways that had nothing to do with what I could do for other people. When I told Dad about the bread opportunity the next morning, his reaction surprised me. "You should do it," he said immediately. "Your mother would be proud. It would mean I'd be busier, less available for—" "Good," he interrupted, the word sharp and decisive. "You should be busier. You should have your own things to worry about." I stared at him, wondering when he'd started thinking this way. "You don't mind?" "Izzy." He set down his coffee and looked at me directly. "I've been watching you disappear for 3 years. It scares me more than the stroke did." His honesty was so unexpected, so complete, that I felt tears spring to my eyes. "I don't know how to be both," I admitted. "I don't know how to take care of you and build something for myself at the same time." "Then figure it out," he said gently. "But don't give up the figuring out part. That's not what love looks like." His words echoed Lorraine's from weeks earlier, and I realized that the people who actually saw me, really saw me, had been trying to push me toward this realization for longer than I'd understood. That afternoon, I called Mary Chen and accepted her offer. Then I sat down to create a real business plan, complete with startup costs, production schedules, and growth projections. For the first time in years, I was planning a future that belonged to me. I had no idea that within weeks, my secret bread business would lead to discoveries about our property that would change everything. I didn't know that documenting my small acts of independence would eventually connect me with thousands of people who felt just as trapped and invisible as I had, but I knew that something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer just managing my life. I was creating it. And that change, small as it seemed, was about to transform everything. The bread business launched me into a new rhythm of existence that felt both exhilarating and exhausting. 3 times a week, I rose at 4 a.m. to begin the complex dance of timing that commercial baking required. Sourdough starters needed feeding, dough needed precise periods of rising, ovens needed careful temperature management. By 7 a.m., I had 12 perfect loaves cooling on racks, ready for delivery to Mary Chen's restaurant. Dad adapted to the new schedule with surprising grace. He started setting his own alarm for 6, giving himself time to get dressed and handle his morning medication routine independently. The first few mornings, I checked on him constantly, but he waved me away with gentle irritation. "I'm not helpless. Izzy," he reminded me. "I'm just slower than I used to be." The distinction mattered more than I'd realized. In my determination to protect him from any struggle, I'd been treating him like he was incapable rather than just differently capable. The adjustment was harder for me than it was for him. The bread deliveries themselves became a highlight of my week. The drive to Millbrook took me through countryside I'd forgotten was beautiful, past farms that were thriving in ways ours hadn't for years. Mary Chen's restaurant, the Harvest Table, occupied a renovated barn that perfectly balanced rustic charm with sophisticated functionality. Mary herself was a force of nature, 42 years old, with the intensity of someone who'd left a successful corporate law career to follow her passion for sustainable agriculture and farm-to-table dining. She treated my bread with the kind of reverence I'd never experienced for my own work. "Your sourdough has completely changed our bread service," she told me during my 3rd delivery. "We're selling out every night, and people are asking about purchasing loaves to take home." The request for retail sales sparked an idea that had been percolating in the back of my mind. If there was demand for my bread beyond restaurant service, maybe there was an opportunity to expand in ways I hadn't considered. "How much demand are we talking about?" I asked. "Honestly, I could probably move 24 loaves a week just through customer requests, but you'd need some kind of retail setup, proper packaging, maybe a small storefront presence." I drove home that day thinking about possibilities. Our farm was only 12 miles from Millbrook, an easy drive for customers who wanted genuinely local products. The cottage where my great-grandfather had lived sat right at the edge of our property, visible from the main road. With some renovation, it could become exactly the kind of retail space Mary was describing. That evening, I walked through the cottage with Dad, both of us seeing it through new eyes. The building had good bones, solid stone foundation, large windows, a floor plan that could easily accommodate retail space in the front and production space in the back. "It would need significant work," Dad observed, running his hand along a windowsill that needed repainting. "New electrical, updated plumbing, proper insulation." "How significant?" He was quiet for several minutes, moving through the space with the methodical assessment of someone who'd spent his life maintaining buildings. 10,000, maybe 12, if we did most of the work ourselves. It was more money than I had, but not more than I could potentially borrow against future business income. The bigger question was whether I was ready to commit to something that substantial, something that would transform me from someone who baked bread as a side business into someone who ran an actual bakery. "What do you think?" I asked. Dad smiled, the expression more complete than I'd seen from him in months. "I think your great-grandfather would be proud to see the cottage used for something productive again. He always said this land was meant to provide for people." Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into research with the intensity I'd once reserved for managing family crises. I learned about cottage food laws, business licensing requirements, and small business loan programs. I discovered that our county offered grants for rural business development, especially businesses that supported agricultural tourism. But the more I researched, the more I realized that I needed guidance from someone who understood both the business side and the personal complexities of what I was attempting. that someone turned out to be Felix Ryden, though I didn't know it yet. I first noticed Felix during my 3rd week of bread deliveries. He was the mail carrier for our rural route, and unlike his predecessor, a gruff man who'd treated mail delivery like a race against time, Felix actually stopped to chat with people. I'd seen him talking with neighbors, helping elderly residents, carry packages, even taking time to pet dogs that ran out to greet him. What I didn't know was that Felix had been observing me too. "You're the baker," he said one afternoon when our paths crossed at the end of our driveway. It wasn't a question. I stopped, surprised by the direct approach. "I'm sorry?" "The bread you make for the harvest table. Mary Chen's been talking about it all over town. Said it's the best sourdough she's had outside of San Francisco." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "Oh, that's very kind of her to say." Felix smiled, and I noticed that his whole face changed when he did. Became warmer, more approachable. "I'm Felix, by the way. I've been delivering your mail for about 6 months, but I don't think we've officially met." "Izzy Marelly." I gestured toward the house. "My father and I live here." "I know. Emerin Marelly, right? How's he doing since his stroke?" I remember when it happened. The whole community was worried about him. The casual mention of community concern surprised me. I'd been so focused on managing Dad's immediate needs that I'd forgotten how visible our family had once been in Elkridge Hollow, how many people had genuine affection for him. "He's doing much better, thank you. Slower than he'd like, but stronger than the doctors expected." "That's good to hear." Felix shifted his mail bag to his other shoulder. "And I understand you gave up quite a bit to come back and help with his care." The comment was casual, but something in his tone suggested he understood more about sacrifice than his easy manner might indicate. "Family is family," I said, the automatic response I'd perfected over 3 years. "True," Felix agreed, "but it's also true that you can't pour from an empty cup forever." It was almost exactly what Lorraine had said, but coming from someone I barely knew, the words carried a different weight. How many people in Elkridge Hollow had been watching my gradual disappearance into caretaking? How many had noticed things I thought were invisible? "I'm working on that," I said, surprised by my own honesty. "The bread business is a good start," Felix observed. "What's next?" It was such a natural question, asked with such genuine interest, that I found myself explaining about the cottage, the retail possibility, the grants I was researching. Felix listened with the kind of attention that made me feel like my ideas were worth taking seriously. "You know," he said when I finished, "my ex-girlfriend was a business consultant before we moved up here. She used to say that the hardest part of starting a business wasn't the money or the planning. It was believing you deserved to take up that much space in the world." The observation hit me with unexpected force. Did she start her own business? She did, actually. Very successful now. Consulting for small rural businesses, helping them develop sustainable models. His expression grew thoughtful. "You might want to talk to someone like that. Someone who understands both the business side and the personal side of making a big change." After Felix continued on his route, I stood in our driveway thinking about his words, believing you deserve to take up that much space in the world. How much space had I been allowing myself? How much space did I think I deserved? That evening, I sat down with my laptop and opened a new document. Instead of researching business loans or cottage renovation costs, I started writing about the conversation I'd overheard between my siblings. I wrote about the moment I'd realized I was invisible to the people I loved most. I wrote about the strange liberation of discovering that I had choices I'd forgotten existed. I wrote for 2 hours, pouring out thoughts and feelings I'd never articulated to anyone. When I finished, I stared at the document, unsure what to do with it. It wasn't a business plan or a grant application. It was just the truth about what it felt like to disappear into other people's needs, and then slowly, carefully, begin to reappear. On impulse, I copied the text and posted it to an anonymous blog I created on a whim. I titled it The Invisible Caretaker and published it without any expectation that anyone would read it. Within 24 hours, the post had been shared 300 times. Within a week, I had messages from people all over the country who recognized themselves in my story. Women who'd given up careers to care for aging parents. Men who'd sacrificed their own dreams to keep family businesses afloat. Adult children who'd become invisible in the service of family needs they'd never chosen but couldn't abandon. Reading their responses was like discovering I wasn't alone in a way I'd never realized I needed. These weren't people looking for sympathy or solutions. They were people who understood exactly what it felt like to love someone so completely that you forgot to love yourself. I started writing more posts, documenting my small acts of rebellion and self-reclamation. I wrote about starting the bread business, about researching the cottage renovation, about the complicated process of learning to want things for myself again. Each post generated more responses, more shared stories, more evidence that my experience wasn't unique or shameful or selfish. The blog became a secret outlet for processing the changes happening in my life. But it also became something more, a way of mattering to people who weren't dying or disappearing, a way of taking up space in the world without asking permission from anyone. 1 month after that first post, I received a message that would change everything again. It was from someone who identified herself only as another invisible daughter, and it contained a single line that made my heart stop. I think I know who you are, and I want you to know that you're inspiring more people in your own community than you realize. Don't stop writing. Don't stop building. You matter more than you know. I stared at the message for a long time, wondering who in Elkridge Hollow had connected my anonymous writing to my real identity. But instead of feeling exposed or vulnerable, I felt seen in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. That night, I walked through the cottage again, envisioning not just a bakery, but a gathering place. Somewhere people could come for good bread and real conversation. Somewhere the invisible could become visible, even if just for the length of time it took to share a meal. I was no longer just planning a business. I was planning a revolution, one loaf of bread at a time. The truth about who had been reading. My blog came to light on a Tuesday morning in early May, when spring had finally settled over Elkridge Hollow with the kind of gentle warmth that made everything seem possible. I was in the cottage, measuring spaces and taking notes for the renovation proposal I planned to submit for the county business development grant, when I heard a car pull into our driveway. Through the cottage window, I watched Dell climb out of her battered Honda Civic, moving with the kind of nervous energy that meant she had something difficult to say. She wasn't supposed to be here. Her last text had mentioned finals week and summer internship preparations. My stomach clenched with the automatic assumption that something terrible had happened. I met her at the farmhouse door, where she stood, fidgeting with her car keys and avoiding my eyes. "Dell? What's wrong? Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," she said quickly, then paused and shook her head. "Actually, no. Everything's not fine, but not in the way you think." She followed me into the kitchen, where Dad was reading agricultural magazines at the table. He looked up with genuine pleasure at seeing her. Dell's visits were rare enough to qualify as special occasions. "Delphina, what brings you home, sweetheart?" "Hi, Dad." She kissed his cheek, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. "I needed to talk to Izzy about something. Would you mind if I'll be in my study," Dad said, gathering his magazines with understanding. "Good to see you, honey." After he left, Dell and I stood in the kitchen facing each other across a silence that felt loaded with things neither of us wanted to say. "Dell, you're scaring me. What's going on?" She took a deep breath and pulled out her phone. "I need to show you something, but first I need you to know that I figured it out by accident. I wasn't trying to spy on you or invade your privacy or anything like that." She opened a browser on her phone and navigated to a blog that I recognized immediately. My blog. The invisible caretaker was displayed at the top of the screen, along with my most recent post about planning the cottage renovation. My heart stopped. How did you— The bread, Del said quietly. You wrote about starting a bread business, about delivering to a restaurant in Millbrook. There's only one farm-to-table place in Millbrook, and when I called to make a reservation for Mom's birthday, the anniversary, Mary Chen mentioned that their bread supplier was a young woman from Elkridge Hollow who'd given up a pastry career to care for her father. The room felt like it was tilting. You know about the blog. I've been reading it for 2 months, Del admitted, since you started writing about the family dynamics. Izzy, some of the things you wrote about, the conversations you overheard, the maid comment, I said flatly. Del's face crumpled. God, Izzy, I am so sorry. We were awful. I was awful. I knew it was wrong when Cassian said it, and I should have spoken up, but I was uncomfortable, and I didn't want to deal with the conflict. I sat down heavily at the kitchen table, my mind racing. Del had been reading my blog for 2 months. She'd known about my growing resentment, my business plans, my slow emergence from invisible caretaking. She'd known, and she'd said nothing. Why? Didn't you say anything? Why didn't you tell me you knew? Del sat across from me, her hands twisted together. Because I was ashamed. Because reading your blog made me realize how selfish I've been. How much I've taken your sacrifice for granted. Because I didn't know how to face you after reading what it really felt like to be you. The honesty in her voice was raw, painful. So you just kept reading? At first, yes. But then something else started happening. She scrolled through her phone and showed me the comments section of my blog. Look at how many people you're helping. Look at how many people feel less alone because of what you're writing. I stared at the screen, seeing hundreds of comments I'd been reading for weeks, but somehow hadn't fully absorbed. Women who'd found the courage to set boundaries with demanding family members. Men who'd started pursuing abandoned dreams after reading about my bread business. Adult children who'd begun having honest conversations about caregiving responsibilities and personal needs. You're not just documenting your own transformation, Del continued. You're giving other people permission to transform too. You're showing them that love doesn't have to mean disappearing. The observation hit me with unexpected force. I'd been thinking of the blog as a private outlet, a way to process my own experience. I hadn't considered that sharing my story might be actively helping other people navigate similar situations. But that's not why I'm here, Del said, her voice dropping. I'm here because of something else I figured out. Something about our family that you need to know. She pulled up another screen on her phone. Bank records, financial statements, documents I recognized but had never seen compiled together. I've been doing some research, Del said carefully. About Dad's finances, about the farm, about why money has always been such a struggle here. Del, that's private. Izzy, Dad has been sending money to Cassian. The words hung in the air between us, nonsensical and impossible. What do you mean? Cassian sends money to us. For Dad's care, for the farm. That's what I thought too. But look at this. She showed me bank statements going back 3 years. Every month, Dad transfers $500 to Cassian's account, the same amount Cassian sends back to us 2 weeks later. I stared at the numbers, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Why would Dad send money to Cassian just so Cassian could send it back? Because Cassian asked him to, Del said quietly. I called him yesterday. I confronted him about it. Izzy, Cassian has been basically laundering Dad's money to make it look like he's supporting the family financially. The implications crashed over me like cold water. But why? Because it makes him feel less guilty about not being here. Because it lets him tell people that he's supporting his disabled father and the family farm. Because it costs him nothing but makes him look generous and responsible. I thought about every conversation where Cassian had mentioned sending money, Every time I'd felt grateful for his financial contribution. Every moment when I'd felt like his support justified his absence. How long have you known about this? Since yesterday. I drove straight here after I confirmed it. Dell's voice was thick with emotion. Izzy, I've been complicit in so much of this. I knew you were sacrificing everything, and I told myself it was okay because Cassian was helping financially. But he wasn't helping. He was just performing, helping. The revelation recontextualized 3 years of family dynamics in ways that made me feel nauseated. Does Dad know that Cassian is just sending his own money back to him? I don't think. So, I think Cassian convinced him it was some kind of tax strategy or investment arrangement. You know how Dad gets when finances are involved. He just trusts people to handle things properly. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the land that had shaped my entire life. The cottage where I'd been planning my bakery sat at the edge of the property, representing possibilities I'd been building carefully, step by step. But those possibilities had been constructed on a foundation of lies I hadn't known existed. There's more, Dell said behind me. I did some research on the farm's value, on what our options really are. Izzy, this property is worth almost 4 times what we thought. The land alone is worth enough to set Dad up comfortably for the rest of his life, with assisted care if he wants it. And there would be enough left over for all of us to have real choices. I turned back to face her. What are you saying? I'm saying that none of this had to happen the way it did. I'm saying that you didn't have to sacrifice your scholarship, your career, your life in the city. There were always other options, but we never explored them because it was easier to just let you handle everything. The truth of it was staggering. I'd built my entire identity around the necessity of my sacrifice, the unavoidable nature of my role as family caretaker. But if there had always been alternatives, if my presence here had been a choice rather than an imperative, then what did that make the last 3 years of my life? Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Dell stood up and moved toward me, her expression intense. Because reading your blog made me realize that we turned you into our solution instead of treating you like our sister. Because I love you, and I've been watching you disappear for 3 years, and I can't stand it anymore. Because you deserve to know the truth about your choices. She paused, looking out the window toward the cottage. And because I think you're building something beautiful here, something that's entirely yours, and I want you to do it because you choose to, not because you think you have to. I followed her gaze toward the cottage, thinking about all the plans I'd been making, all the dreams I'd been allowing myself to nurture. The bread business, the retail space, the blog that had connected me with people around the world who understood. Invisible sacrifice. None of it had been built on obligation. All of it had grown from my own desires, my own choices, my own reclaimed sense of worth. I want to tell Cassian, I said finally. Tell him what? Everything. About the blog. About what I know about what you've discovered. I want him to understand what his performance of generosity has cost all of us. Dell nodded slowly. What about Dad? I thought about the man who'd been encouraging my bread business, who'd supported the cottage renovation plans, who told me that watching me disappear scared him more than his stroke had. I think Dad already knows more than he's been saying, I said. I think maybe we all need to start having conversations we should have had 3 years ago. That evening, after Dell had gone back to New York with promises to return for a family, meeting the following weekend, I sat in Mom's sewing room with my laptop open. For the first time since I'd started the blog, I didn't know what to write. Everything I thought I knew about my situation had been reframed. My sacrifice, while real, hadn't been as necessary as I'd believed. My siblings' neglect had been even more calculated than I'd realized. My father's needs, while genuine, had been manageable in ways we'd never explored. But here was the strange thing. None of these revelations made me want to abandon what I'd been building. If anything, they made me more determined to continue. The bread business, The cottage renovation, the blog, all of it represented something I'd chosen rather than something I'd been trapped into. I was no longer the invisible caretaker who'd given up everything for family obligation. I was someone who'd discovered her own worth in the midst of an impossible situation and decided to build a life that honored both love and choice. The story wasn't over. In fact, I was beginning to suspect it was just beginning. The family meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday, though it took 3 days of careful negotiation to get everyone to agree to participate. Cassian initially tried to dismiss the entire gathering as unnecessary drama, but Dell had learned to be persistent in ways that surprised both of us. Dad simply asked, "What's this about?" And when I told him we needed to have some honest conversations about family dynamics and financial arrangements, he nodded with the resignation of someone who'd been expecting this moment for longer than he'd been willing to admit. I spent the week preparing in ways that went far beyond cleaning the house and planning meals. This wasn't going to be a typical family visit where I managed everyone's comfort while avoiding difficult topics. This was going to be a reckoning, and I needed to be ready for it. First, I gathered all the documentation Dell had shown me about the financial arrangements, plus additional research I'd done on our own. Bank statements, property assessments, care cost estimates, everything laid out in neat folders that told the story of choices we'd made and choices we'd avoided. Second, I printed out every blog post I'd written over the past 3 months. Reading them in chronological order was like watching myself wake up from a long sleep. The early posts were full of confusion and hurt, but gradually they showed someone discovering her own agency, her own worth, her own capacity to build something meaningful. Finally, I prepared emotionally by spending long hours in the cottage, visualizing the bakery I wanted to create. I could see customers browsing shelves of fresh bread, smell the yeast and flour that would become my daily companions, feel the satisfaction of work that fed people in both literal and metaphorical ways. This vision had become my anchor, not as an escape from family obligations, but as proof that love and independence could coexist. Felix appeared in our driveway Thursday afternoon, ostensibly to deliver a package, but clearly with something more on his mind. I was in the cottage taking measurements when I saw his mail truck, and I walked out to meet him with the kind of nervous anticipation that had become familiar since we'd started talking regularly. "How are the renovation plans coming along?" he asked, handing me a package addressed to Dad. "Good. Complicated, but good." I paused, then decided to trust him with the truth. "My family's coming this weekend. We're going to have some conversations that are long overdue." Felix studied my face with the careful attention he brought to most things. "Want to talk about it?" I found myself explaining about Dell's discoveries, about the financial arrangements I hadn't known existed, about the family meeting that felt like stepping into completely unknown territory. Felix listened without judgment, asking clarifying questions that helped me organize my own thoughts. "It sounds like you're not just confronting your family," he observed when I finished. "You're confronting 3 years of assumptions about what you owed them and what they owed you." "Exactly. And I'm terrified that when I start speaking honestly about all of it, I won't be able to stop, that I'll say things that can't be taken back." Would that be such a bad thing? The question caught me off guard. I don't know. Part of me thinks honesty might destroy what's left of our relationships. But part of me thinks what's left isn't worth preserving if it requires me to stay invisible. Felix was quiet for a moment, looking toward the farmhouse where Dad was probably reading in his study, then back toward the cottage where my future was slowly taking shape. "You know what I've noticed about you?" he said finally. "You've spent so much energy protecting other people from the consequences of their choices that you forgot you deserve protection too." His words settled into my chest like seeds, promising to grow into understanding I wasn't quite ready for yet. Friday evening, I made my final preparations while Dad watched television in the living room. I'd told him about the financial discoveries Dell had made, and his reaction had been exactly what I'd expected. A mixture of embarrassment, anger, and relief that the truth was finally coming out. I suspected something wasn't right about Cassian's arrangement, he'd admitted. But I didn't want to question it because I was grateful he was involved at all. Dad, did you ever consider other options? Assisted living, care services, anything. That would have meant I didn't have to give up my scholarship? He'd been quiet for a long time before answering. Yes, but not seriously. Because having you here wasn't just about what I needed. It was about what you needed too. What I needed. After your mother died, you were lost, Izzy. Angry and lost and looking for a way to matter again. When I had the stroke, taking care of me gave you purpose. I thought it was helping you as much as it was helping me. The observation was uncomfortable in its accuracy. I had been lost after Mom's death, struggling to find meaning in a pastry career that suddenly felt frivolous compared to the magnitude of loss. Taking care of Dad had given me a sense of purpose, even as it constrained my choices in ways I'd resented. But I got better, he continued, stronger, more independent, and you didn't adjust. You kept treating me like I was as helpless as I'd been right after the stroke. I didn't know how to tell you that I didn't need as much care anymore without making you feel unnecessary. It was the most honest conversation we'd had since I'd moved back home, and it revealed layers of miscommunication and misplaced protectiveness that had shaped all our interactions. So we were both trying to protect each other from truths we thought would be hurtful, I said. Seems that way. And meanwhile, Cassian was trying to protect himself from guilt by pretending to contribute financially, and Dell was trying to protect herself from responsibility by staying away entirely. Dad smiled ruefully. Your mother used to say that families were just groups of people who loved each other badly until they figured out how to love each other well. Did she think we'd figure it out? She thought you would. She always said you were the one who saw people clearly, who understood what they needed even when they didn't understand it themselves. Saturday morning arrived gray and humid with the kind of heavy air that promised afternoon thunderstorms. Cassian drove up from the city in his pristine BMW, carrying expensive coffee and pastries from a bakery that charged $12 for what I could make for $3. Dell arrived an hour later, looking tired but determined. We gathered in the living room after lunch, the four of us arranged in a semicircle that felt both familiar and completely foreign. I sat with my folders of documentation, my printed blog, posts, and my carefully prepared talking points. But suddenly none of it felt adequate for the conversation we needed to have. Before we start, I said, looking at each of them in turn, I want you all to know that this isn't about blame or punishment. It's about understanding what's been happening in our family and figuring out how to move forward in ways that work for everyone. Cassian shifted uncomfortably. Dell said this was about financial arrangements. I'm not sure what. It's about honesty, I interrupted gently. About the difference between supporting this family and performing support. About the cost of assumptions we've never examined. I started with the financial revelations, walking through the bank statements and documentation Dell had gathered. Watching Cassian's face as I explained what we'd discovered was like watching someone realize they'd been caught in a lie they'd convinced themselves wasn't really lying. It was a tax strategy, he said weakly, moving money through different accounts for optimization purposes. Cassian, Dad said quietly, it's okay. You don't have to keep pretending. The simple permission to stop performing seemed to deflate something in my brother. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time in years, he looked genuinely vulnerable. I wanted to help, he said finally. But I also wanted to build my career, and I wanted to live my life, and I couldn't figure out how to do both. So I found a way to feel like I was contributing without actually having to sacrifice anything. While I sacrificed everything, I added, not accusingly, but as a statement of fact. Yes. And I told myself it was okay because you seemed to want to be here, because you seemed to find purpose in taking care of Dad. But you never asked me what I wanted. None of you did. Dell spoke up from across the room. Because we were afraid of what you might say. Because it was easier to assume you were content than to deal with the possibility that you weren't. The honesty was brutal and necessary. We spent the next hour unpacking 3 years of miscommunication, false assumptions, and choices made to protect everyone's comfort except mine. It was painful, but it was also clarifying in ways I hadn't expected. When we finished discussing the past, I pulled out my laptop and showed them the blog I'd been writing. For the past 3 months, I've been documenting what it's felt like to be the invisible member of this family, I said. I want you to understand the impact of our dynamics, but I also want you to see what I've been building in response to them. I read them selected posts about overhearing the maid comment, about starting the bread business, about planning the cottage renovation, about slowly rediscovering my own worth and agency. Their faces showed a progression of emotions: shame, recognition, surprise, and finally, something that looked like pride. "Izzy," Cassian said when I finished, you're helping so many people." "I'm helping myself," I corrected, "and that's helping other people feel less alone in their own situations." "But you're not leaving, are you?" Del asked, and I could hear genuine anxiety in her voice. "You're not giving up on us entirely?" It was the question I'd been wrestling with for weeks. The financial revelations meant I had choices I hadn't known existed. The blog's success meant I had opportunities that extended far beyond Elkridge Hollow. The cottage renovation represented a future I could build anywhere. "I'm not leaving," I said carefully. "But I'm not staying the way I was before either. I'm staying because I choose to. Because I want to build something here that's mine. Because I love Dad and want to be part of his life in ways that work for both of us." I looked at each of them in turn. "But I need things to change. I need honest communication about responsibilities and expectations. I need recognition for the choices I'm making and the work I'm doing. I need to matter in this family as more than just the person who handles everything difficult." "What do you need from us specifically?" Dad asked. It was the question I'd been hoping someone would ask, and I was ready with answers. "I need Cassian to either contribute financially for real or stop pretending he's contributing. I need Del to visit when she says she will, and help with actual responsibilities when she's here. I need all of us to talk openly about Dad's care needs and share them appropriately. And I need space to build my business and my life without feeling guilty for wanting things that don't center around this family." The requests were reasonable, but asking for them felt revolutionary after 3 years of invisible self-sacrifice. "And if we can't do those things?" Cassian asked. I looked toward the cottage, visible through the living room window, representing everything I was ready to build for myself. "Then I'll love you from whatever distance I need to maintain in order to love myself too," I said. It was the most honest thing I'd ever said to my family, and the most frightening. But it was also the truest, and I was finally ready to prioritize truth over comfort. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke as we sat in the living room, processing what felt like a complete reorganization of our family dynamics. But instead of feeling destructive, the thunder and rain felt cleansing, like the atmosphere clearing after too much pressure had built up. We weren't finished talking. There were still details to work out, boundaries to establish, new patterns to create. But for the first time in 3 years, I felt like we were having the right conversation. And for the first time since I'd overheard that devastating comment about being the maid, I felt like I was visible to the people I loved most. The week following our family meeting moved with the strange, suspended quality of time that comes after everything fundamental has shifted but before the new reality has fully settled into place. It was like we were standing at the edge of something vast, the shoreline of a life that hadn't fully formed yet. Cassian had returned to Seattle with promises to establish genuine financial support for Dad's care and the farm's maintenance. Del had extended her stay through the weekend, throwing herself into cottage renovation planning with the enthusiasm of someone making up for lost time. I kept catching her in moments of near-manic focus, sketching layouts, making supply lists, calling contractors, as if the busyness could make up for years of absence. But it was Wednesday evening when everything truly crystallized, when the theoretical changes we'd discussed became irreversibly real. I was in the cottage, surrounded by paper and lamplight, reviewing contractor estimates and floor plans, a mug of forgotten tea cooling beside me. The air smelled faintly of fresh wood and dust, remnants of earlier efforts to strip the space down to its bones. I had started envisioning what this place could become, but I hadn't dared to imagine beyond a small retail setup. Not yet. That's when I heard a car pull into our driveway with unusual urgency, tires crunching gravel like punctuation. Through the window, I saw Dell's Honda, headlights slicing across the dark. But she was supposed to be in class. My stomach clenched with the familiar anxiety that had defined 3 years of unexpected visits and crisis management. Every late arrival had once signaled something broken, something needing fixing. I hurried back to the house, already on edge. I found her in the kitchen, pacing with nervous energy while Dad watched from his chair, his expression unreadable, though alert in a way I hadn't seen in months. "What's wrong?" I asked immediately. "Nothing's wrong," Dell said quickly, too quickly, like someone trying to convince herself. Then she stopped pacing and turned to face me, her eyes shining with a clarity that startled me. "Actually, everything's wrong, but not in a bad way." "Izzy, sit down." I remained standing, too keyed up to relax until I understood what was happening. "I quit school," she said, just like that, like she was telling me the weather forecast. The words hung in the air, impossible and immediate. "You what?" I withdrew from the fashion program. Officially. This morning. "Dell, no." The response was automatic, shaped by 3 years of protecting everyone else's future while forfeiting my own. "You can't do that. You're so close to finishing, and the opportunities in New York are not what I want," she interrupted firmly. "Izzy, listen to me. Really listen. I hate fashion design. I've hated it for 2 years. I only stuck with it because I was afraid to admit I'd made the wrong choice, because I was afraid of disappointing everyone, because I was afraid of coming home and facing what I'd left you to handle alone." I sank into the chair across from her, my mind struggling to process this reversal of everything I thought I knew about my sister's life. "But you're talented," I protested. "You've worked so hard." "I'm talented at something I don't enjoy, working toward a career I don't want, in a city that makes me feel like I'm slowly disappearing." Dell's voice carried a conviction I hadn't heard from her in years. Sound familiar? The parallel hit me like a slap. This is because of the blog, isn't it? Because of what I wrote about sacrifice and choices. Partly. But mostly it's because watching you rediscover what you actually want made me realize I've never even asked myself that question. Dell sat down across from me, her expression intense with a kind of earnest vulnerability that reminded me of our childhood. "Izzy, I want to come home. Not to hide or to avoid responsibility, but to build something here. With you. With Dad. In this place that I've been running from because I was too scared to figure out how to love it properly." Dad had been quiet during this exchange, but now he cleared his throat, a sound that drew both our gazes. "Tell her the rest, Delphina." Del took a breath like she was about to jump into something deep. "I want to be your business partner. In the bakery, in the blog, in whatever you're building here. I know I haven't earned the right to ask for that yet, but I want to earn it. I want to learn from you, work with you, help you create something bigger than either of us could manage alone." I stared at her, trying to reconcile this decisive, passionate person with the sister who'd spent years avoiding phone calls and holidays. "Del, you can't just upend your entire life because of guilt about our family dynamics. I'm not." Her voice was steady, certain. "I'm upending my life because I finally figured out what I actually want it to look like. And what I want is to be here, contributing to something meaningful, learning to love this family and this place in ways that don't require anyone to disappear. She pulled out her phone and showed me a document that made my heart stop. A business plan. Detailed, professional, comprehensive. It wasn't some vague gesture of good intention. She'd outlined everything from expansion strategies for the bread business to marketing plans for the blog, from cottage renovation timelines to staffing projections for a full-scale bakery operation. "I've been working on this for 2 weeks," she said. "Since the day I figured out who you were online. Izzy, you're not just helping individuals anymore. You're creating a movement. People are starting businesses, leaving toxic relationships, setting boundaries with family members, all because you showed them what it looks like to reclaim their own life." I scrolled through the document, seeing my small acts of rebellion and self-discovery analyzed and expanded into something that could reach thousands of people. It was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. "But this would be huge," I said. "This isn't just a local bakery anymore. This is a platform, a brand, a way to turn your personal transformation into something that helps other people transform too." Dell finished. "Izzy, you've been thinking too small. You've been so focused on building something for yourself that you haven't realized you're building something for everyone who's ever felt invisible in their own life." I looked at Dad, who'd been watching this exchange with growing amusement. "What do you think about all this?" "I think," he said carefully, "that your mother would be proud to see both her daughters building something together instead of running away from each other. But what about your care? What about the farm? What about all the responsibilities that made me come home in the first place?" Dad smiled, the expression more complete than I'd seen from him since before his stroke. "Izzy, I've been getting stronger for months. My physical therapy is working, my independence is improving, and frankly, having you hover over me has been holding both of us back." He gestured toward the window that faced the cottage. "I want to see you build that bakery. I want to watch customers discover your bread and your story. I want to be part of something growing instead of just something being maintained. And as for care," Dell added, "that's something we'll share. All of us. The way families are supposed to." I sat there surrounded by these two people who were asking me to dream bigger than I'd allowed myself to imagine, to trust them with responsibilities I'd been carrying alone, to believe that collaboration might be possible in a family that had been defined by disconnection and avoidance. "I need to think about this," I said finally. "Of course. But Izzy?" Dell reached across the table and took my hand. "Whatever you decide, I'm staying. I'm going to find an apartment in town, get a job, figure out how to be the sister and daughter I should have been all along. This isn't conditional on you saying yes to partnership." That night, I walked the property lines in darkness, trying to process the magnitude of what Dell was proposing. The cottage renovation I'd been planning would need to be completely reconceptualized. Instead of a small retail space, we'd need room for significant production, customer seating, possibly even event hosting. Instead of a local business serving our immediate community, we'd be creating something with regional, possibly national reach. It was exciting and overwhelming in ways that made me feel simultaneously empowered and completely out of my depth. Found Felix at the edge of our property the next morning, checking mailboxes but clearly waiting for me to appear. Word traveled fast in small communities, and Dell's dramatic arrival the night before had probably been noticed by multiple neighbors. "I heard Dell's back," he said without preamble. "She's back for good. She quit school, wants to be my business partner, has about 1,000 ideas for expanding everything I've been building." Felix studied my face. "How do you feel about that?" It was such a simple question, but it cut straight to the heart of my confusion. Terrified, excited, angry that she thinks she can just swoop in and redesign my life, grateful that someone finally wants to build something with me instead of just letting me handle everything alone. Sounds complicated. Everything about my family is complicated. I paused, then asked the question I'd been avoiding. "Do you think I should do it?" Partner with her? Expand the business? Turn this into something bigger than I ever planned? Felix was quiet for a long moment, looking toward the cottage where Dell's car was parked, then back toward the farmhouse. I think, he said finally, that you've spent 3 years learning to trust your own judgment about what you want and what you're capable of. You don't need my permission or anyone else's to make this choice. But what if I choose wrong? What if partnering with Dell just recreates the same family dynamics in a different form? What if I'm not ready for something this big? What if you are? Felix countered gently. What if 3 years of invisible sacrifice taught you exactly how to build something visible and meaningful? What if learning to love your family from a distance taught you how to love them up close in healthier ways? His words settled into my chest like a truth I'd been avoiding. I had learned things during my years of caretaking, about resilience, about patience, about the difference between love and enabling, about the importance of maintaining yourself while caring for others. Maybe those lessons were exactly what I needed to build something larger and more complex. There's something else, I said. If we expand the way Dell is suggesting, if we turn this into a platform for helping other people reclaim their lives, then I can't stay anonymous anymore. The blog, the business, all of it would be connected to my real identity. Is that what scares you? Being visible? I thought about the question seriously. No. What scares me is being responsible for other people's transformations when I'm still figuring out my own. Felix smiled. Maybe that's exactly what makes you qualified to help them. That afternoon, I sat down with Dell and Dad to discuss specifics. We talked about timelines and financing, about family responsibilities and business boundaries, about the difference between collaboration and codependence. We talked until the sun set and the kitchen filled with the golden light of early evening. By the time we finished, we had the framework for something unprecedented, a family business built on honest communication, shared responsibility, and mutual support for individual growth. It wasn't perfect, and it would require constant attention to maintain healthy dynamics, but it was real, and it was ours. So, Dell asked, as we cleared away the notebooks and coffee cups and pages of scribbled plans. Are we doing this? I looked around the kitchen where I'd spent 3 years feeling invisible, where I'd overheard the conversation that broke my heart, where I'd slowly learned to want things for myself again. I thought about the cottage that would become our bakery, about the blog that would become our platform, about the customers who would find us and the people around the world who would read our story. I thought about the woman I'd been when I gave up my scholarship to come home, and the woman I'd become through the process of rediscovering my own worth. Yes, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. We're doing this. And just like that, everything changed again. But this time, I was choosing the change instead of having it chosen for me. This time, I was visible in my own life. 6 months later, I stood in the doorway of what had once been my great-grandfather's cottage, watching customers browse shelves of fresh bread while the scent of baking sourdough filled the air. The transformation was complete but ongoing. Every day brought new refinements, new connections, new possibilities I hadn't imagined when this journey began. The Hollow Hearth Bakery had opened to lines of customers that stretched down our driveway and onto the main road. Local food bloggers discovered us, then regional magazines, then a feature in a national publication about rural businesses that were redefining community connection. But what moved me most were the individual stories. People who drove hours to try our bread, who stayed to share their own experiences of feeling invisible in their families, who found courage in our story to make changes in their own lives. Dell had proven herself as more than just an enthusiastic partner. Her eye for design had transformed the cottage into a space that felt both rustic and sophisticated, while her natural gift for social media had grown our online community exponentially. The blog that had started as my private outlet for processing family dynamics had become a platform followed by over 50,000 people seeking their own path to visibility and self-worth. Dad's role in the business surprised everyone, including himself. His knowledge of local agriculture connected us with farmers who supplied our specialty flours and seasonal ingredients. His memories of the land's history became part of the stories we told customers about the place that had nurtured 4 generations of our family. Most importantly, his genuine pride in what we'd built gave him a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with being cared for, and everything to do with contributing to something meaningful. The family dynamics that had once felt impossibly broken hadn't magically healed, but they had transformed into something workable. Cassian visited monthly now, contributing both financially and emotionally in ways that felt genuine rather than performative. He'd even started bringing his new girlfriend, a woman who appreciated both good bread and honest conversation about family complexity. But the most significant change was in my relationship with myself. I woke up each morning with the kind of anticipation I'd forgotten was possible, eager to see what the day would bring, what challenges I'd solve, what connections I'd make. The work was demanding, but it was demanding in service of something I'd chosen rather than something I'd been trapped into. Felix had become a regular fixture at the bakery, though his role had evolved far beyond mail delivery. He'd started teaching, a weekly bread-making class that filled up within hours of being announced, and his gentle wisdom with struggling customers had made him an unofficial counselor for people working through their own family transitions. "You know what I realized yesterday?" Del said, joining me in the doorway as the afternoon rush began to wind down. "This place has become exactly what Mom always wanted the farm to be, a gathering place where people feel seen and valued." She was right. The bakery had evolved into something more than a business. It was a community hub, where invisible people found their voices, where family stories were honored alongside individual dreams, where the complexity of loving difficult people was acknowledged and supported. That evening, after the last customer had left, and the cottage was clean and ready for tomorrow's early morning baking, I walked through the farmhouse that had once felt like a prison, and now felt like home in an entirely different way. Dad was in his study, working on a memoir project that had grown from our conversations about family history and second chances. Del was in what used to be Mom's sewing room, now converted into our business office, planning the cookbook we'd been asked to write. I ended up in the kitchen, where everything had started with that overheard conversation about being the maid. The room looked the same, but my relationship to it had been completely transformed. This was no longer the place where I disappeared into other people's needs. It was the place where I'd learned to recognize my own worth, where I'd planned my escape from invisibility, where I'd discovered that love could coexist with healthy boundaries. My phone buzzed with a message from someone who'd found our blog and wanted to share their own story of family caretaking and gradual self-reclamation. These messages arrived daily now, from people all over the world who recognized themselves in our journey from invisible sacrifice to visible choice. "Thank you for showing me that I can love my family without disappearing into them." The message read, "Your story gave me permission to want things for myself." I smiled, thinking about how many times I'd received similar messages, how the personal transformation I'd documented had somehow become a roadmap for others navigating similar terrain. The blog had evolved far beyond my individual story. It had become a conversation between people learning to love themselves and others more skillfully. As I prepared for bed, I passed the framed photo of Mom that sat on my dresser. In it, she was laughing at something beyond the camera's view, her face bright with the kind of joy that comes from being completely present in your own life. "I think you'd be proud," I said softly to her image. "Not just of what we've built, but of how we've learned to love each other better." I'd started this journey feeling invisible to the people who mattered most to me. I discovered that visibility wasn't something other people could give me. It was something I had to claim for myself. One choice at a time, one boundary at a time, one dream at a time. The woman who'd given up everything to help her family now helped families all over the world learn that sacrifice and self-love weren't mutually exclusive. The caretaker who'd been called the maid had become someone whose story mattered to thousands of people struggling with similar dynamics. But more than any external recognition, I'd found something I'd never expected. The deep satisfaction of living a life that belonged entirely to me, built on choices I'd made rather than obligations I'd inherited. Tomorrow would bring new customers, new challenges, new opportunities to help people feel seen and valued. But tonight, I fell asleep in the farmhouse where I'd learned to disappear, grateful to have rediscovered how to be visible in my own life. I was no longer the invisible caretaker. I was Izzy Marelly, baker, writer, daughter, sister, and finally, completely myself. It's been 1 year since the Hollow Hearth Bakery opened its doors, and I still wake up every morning wondering if all of this is real. The barn that once listed eastward, abandoned and forgotten, now houses the kind of warmth that lingers in the air like steam rising off fresh bread. Its beams still creak with age, but now they echo laughter, the shuffle of boots, the quiet hum of ovens at work. The same place that once represented decay and endings now stands as a monument to reinvention. We start before dawn. Dell is always the first through the door. Yes, Dell, who once couldn't remember the last time she used a measuring spoon, now wakes before sunrise with flour streaked on her cheek and ideas dancing in her head. I've never told her this, but watching her pull golden loaves from the oven with practiced confidence brings tears to my eyes more than I care to admit. Not because she's perfect, but because she chose this. Chose me. Chose us. Dad usually ambles in around 8, cane tapping lightly on the floor, reading glasses pushed up to his forehead. He doesn't do much heavy lifting anymore, but he does what he can. Collecting receipts, reading industry newsletters, joking with customers, who still remember him from his days bartering cattle prices like a seasoned poker player. He even started a notebook labeled Bakery Wisdom, where he jots down marketing tips and business ideas like, ask about their grandkids before you upsell the rye. He thinks he's being subtle. We let him think so. Some days Cassian visits, more often now. He always calls first. That's our agreement. No more surprise drop-ins, no more emotional ambushes. He still lives in Seattle, still speaks the language of venture capital and stock options. But now when he's here, not texting through dinner, not acting like Elkridge Hollow is something to endure. He invested in the bakery this past spring, not as a silent partner, but as someone who believes in what we're doing. He wrote his check without fanfare, told me, for once, let me help without the smoke and mirrors. And he has. We all do things differently now. Family dinner is sacred. Once a week, no exceptions. Sometimes it's just the three of us, me, Dell, and Dad. Other times Lorraine joins us with one of her impossible pies, or Felix with stories from the post office circuit. We sit around the old dining table that once hosted silent meals heavy with resentment, and we talk. We really talk. Not the polished kind, but the messy kind. The kind that leaves space for disagreement, that tolerates silence, that lets each of us be a full person instead of a role we were cast into long ago. People ask me if I miss Paris, the scholarship, the dream I let go. The truth? I don't. I mourned it for a while. Grieved the version of myself that might have existed in a sunlit patisserie, layering croissants with butter and ambition. But grief is not regret. And this version of my life, the one built in the rubble of other people's expectations, feels more earned, more whole. It's not glossy. It's not framed in Instagram-worthy skylines. But it's real. It's mine, and the bakery, we've grown faster than we anticipated. What started with 6 loaves of sourdough a week has become a full menu. Spelt baguettes, cardamom knots, rosemary focaccia, honey oat sandwich loaves, and Dell's signature lemon cake that people drive 2 counties for. We host workshops now, on sourdough starters, yes, but also on reclaiming identity through food, on the art of care without self-erasure. Because it turns out, this story was never just mine. After the blog went public and my name stopped hiding, behind anonymity, the messages came in waves. People recognizing their own lives in my words. Adult children burned out by caregiving. Women who'd put everyone else first for so long they couldn't remember the last time they had a dream. Men, too. Men who'd been told they were strong if they stayed silent. Who read my blog and realized strength might also mean saying, "I need help." We started something called the Visible Project. Dell's idea, of course, a community initiative, funded partially by bakery profits and partially by local grants. We offer respite services, host storytelling nights, and maintain an anonymous online forum where people can write their own invisible caretaker letters. We've received over 5,000 posts to date. Not all of them have happy endings. Some are bitter. Some are elegies, but all of them are seen. And isn't that what we wanted all along? To be seen. Not just for what we do, but for who we are. For who we could become if someone bothered to look beyond the roles we play. I've changed too. More than I thought possible. I no longer apologize for being unavailable. I no longer fill silences with, "I've got it handled." I say no now. I disappoint people sometimes. I make space for joy, even when the to-do list is incomplete. And perhaps most revolutionary of all, I let myself be loved. Yes, Felix and I are a thing. A quiet thing. A solid thing. He's not some perfect savior from a romance novel. He's a man who once delivered mail and listened well, who lets me cry without fixing it, who lets me shine without stepping in front of the light. We go for long drives on Sundays, bring picnic bread to overlooks, talk about someday raising chickens or maybe bees. We're taking our time, because when you've spent years giving everything away, learning to receive is its own kind of revolution. Sometimes I still walk the old property lines, where the land dips and curves in familiar ways. I think about the version of me who walked here with clenched fists and a secret folder of grievances. She was angry. She was grieving. She was exhausted. But she wasn't broken. She was, in fact, beginning. Beginning to want. Beginning to speak. Beginning to matter. People like to ask what the turning point was. What moment truly changed things? Was it the night I heard my siblings laugh at my expense? Was it the first loaf of bread I sold? Was it the blog post that reached 10,000 views? It wasn't any of those. It was the moment I stopped waiting for someone else to make me visible. The moment I decided that I was worth seeing, whether or not anyone else agreed. That moment didn't change everything immediately, but it changed me, and that was enough to start changing the rest. This place we've built, this bakery, this business, this movement, isn't about escape. It's about return. Not just returning to a place, but to a self. The one who still wanted things. The one who still believed in mornings, in possibility, in the smell of fresh bread carrying hope like steam. And if there's a legacy here, I hope it isn't that I was the sister who came home, or the daughter who stayed, or even the woman who built a bakery in the ruins of her sacrifice. I hope the legacy is this. I didn't disappear, and neither should you. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.